All right, we are recording. Well, hello, folks, and I am delighted to have on my channel a special guest today is Michael Greaney. I hope I'm saying your last name correctly.
Oh yes, you got it first try.
Good. Michael Greaney is the how do you say it? The research director?
Director of Research.
Director of Research for the Center for Economic and Social Justice. And I have followed his work for some time. He's amazing intellect and an amazing amount of information packed into that skull of his. It just blows my mind. He has told me that I must keep him on track because he's easily able to go off on tangents because he just knows so much. And so I told him I would do that. So if I interrupt him, it's not because I'm being rude, it's because he told me to. And Michael has recently been working on a series about the history of socialist thought within Catholicism and how it's a distortion of Catholic social teaching. And he has explored that going all the way back into the 19th century with tremendous detail, talking about things like the letters that people wrote to each other, conversations between Catholic prelates and politicians and political campaigns and newspaper articles and just the whole history. And it's fascinating. I will link to that series in the description here. But before I begin my interrogation of Michael, I want him to talk a little bit about the origins of the Center for Economic and Social Justice and about his work. And I know you work internationally also, right?
Well, in a manner of speaking, if by work internationally, I mean I sit here within the side of the Washington, D.C. Beltway and talk on Facebook to people all around the world, yes. Otherwise, no, I don't work around the world, although I did travel with the American Red Cross into Central South America, the Caribbean, Germany, and a few other places.
Okay, so so about the center?
Okay, the Center for Economic and Social Justice, it's an interfaith think tank. It was formed in 1984 when Dr. Norman Kurland, Father William Faree, Colonel Mac McGrath, and a number of other people whose names I don't recall. I wasn't there. I came along 3 years after its formation. If Dawn Brohan, who is also one of my co-authors of a book that we're coming out with soon called Economic Personalism, which may be out within the next couple of days, actually. She was there and she can remember all the names as soon as she's reminded. But it was April the 7th, 1984 at the cafeteria at the American University here in Washington, D.C. And the reason the center was formed was that Dr. Norman Kurland, had previously worked with Louis Kelso, who is probably best known as the inventor of the Employee Stock Ownership Plan, the ESOP. And he and Norman Louis Kelso, were instrumental in persuading Senator Russell Long, the son of Huey Long, the kingfish, to champion the initial enabling legislation for the ESOP back in 1973. There had been ESOPs in this country prior to that, a couple hundred, in fact. Louis Kelso installed the first one in Monterey, California in Peninsular newspapers in 1956. So it's almost as old as I am. But there had been no specific legislation to encourage ESOPs or give them any special tax benefits. They were just installed as regular retirement plans. Well, Kelso's vision was not for just a retirement plan, but a way to make as many as possible of the people into capital owners, which, if you recall from Rerum Novarum, is in paragraph 46 of the encyclical, where he says the goal should be for as many as possible of the people should prefer to own, meaning own capital. Because, as was noted, and this time I'll get it right, every other time I've said 100 years, it was 200 years ago that Daniel Webster said, power naturally and necessarily follows property. If you want to have a strong political democracy, you pretty much have to make certain it's founded on a strong economic democracy, which means that every person should at least have the access to the opportunity and means to become a capital owner, not collectively as in socialism, or sort of vicariously as through capitalism, where a couple of people own, and then you get to share the benefits of it by working for them or receiving redistribution from them for your democratic capitalism. And interestingly, you had said you were involved with looking at distributism. And some years ago, someone asked, what was it, Michael Novak, how he defined democratic capitalism. And his response was that, well, what he means by democratic capitalism was what Chesterton meant by distributism. Then someone asked the socialist Martin Gardner, who advocated democratic socialism, to say, how do you define democratic socialism? And his response was, well, what Chesterton meant by distributism is what I mean by democratic socialism. So essentially, capitalism and socialism are the same thing if you ask those two. But what the Center for Economic and Social Justice advocates is Kelso's vision of as many as possible of the people being capital owners, which was Chesterton's goal. Chesterton and Belloc in distributism, for instance, distributism, one of these days I'll learn how to talk, can be stated very simply. A policy of small divided property with a preference for family-owned farms and businesses. And then Chesterton said, if a business must be large, it should be owned on shares by the workers. Well, Kelso's response or expansion of that concept was that not just the workers, but as many as possible of the people should own the corporations. This was also what a fellow by the name of Judge Peter Stenger Grosscup was saying back in the early 20th century. He wrote a series of articles calling for the peopleization of the American corporation, so that as many people as possible would own America's corporate wealth instead of having it concentrated in a few hands. Now, the importance of that was that it filled a hole in Catholic social teaching, which was, as I said, Leo XIII had said as many as possible of the people should own, which is fine, but how are you going to finance it? Leo XIII said, well, pay people more so they can save so that they can purchase capital. The problem is that if you raise wages without a corresponding increase in productivity, all you've done is increase costs, which raises the price level, which means that the workers, who are also the consumers, are paying more for the same goods and getting less. So instead of saving, they generally end up dissaving if they get a wage increase without increasing productivity at the same time. See, it's a catch-22. You remember the old complaint where some people said, well, back in the 50s, a man could support a family on a single wage with just a job. He could have a wife and 6 kids. And nowadays, you can't even support one kid with 6 jobs. Well, see, what happens is when you ratchet up pay without increasing productivity, what you're doing is increasing prices. And of course, prices are going to go up faster than the production, which means that the poor boob, the consumer, is going to be paying more and getting less. While the producers, whether they mean to or not, are going to be making more money faster and faster and faster, especially when they replace human labor with technology. Kelso's answer to that was, and he said this in an interview in 1964 in Life magazine, was that if the machine wants our job, let's buy it, meaning let's buy the machine. So that even if you displace workers from a job, if they own the machinery that replaced them, they get the profit from the machinery. Instead of having just wages, they may have wages and profits. Or worst case scenario, or perhaps best case if you don't like to work, is that you can live entirely off the earnings of your capital because you own it. And only an owner has the real right to receive the income from capital. This is why power follows property.
Okay, so is the general participation of citizens in the stock market through things like 401ks. Does that also answer to that need of being
Well,
owners?
I'm glad you asked that, because that gives me a chance to say emphatically no.
And
The
then why not?
the stock market is geared to speculation. And if you've been watching it the last couple of days, it's been up and down like a yo-yo. The prices on the stock market have virtually nothing to do with the real value of those shares. I mean, when I took finance in college and in graduate school, they taught us all these kinds of formulae to figure out the real value of a share and to figure out whether to buy it and or sell it, depending on what the real value of it was based on the performance of the company and all these esoteric formulae that you use. It's completely meaningless because people just gamble on the stock market. It's just a giant casino.
Okay.
What Kelso was talking about was, to use financial language, direct placement of shares to people who would then receive the full payout of earnings attributable to those shares. I mean, you've
So
seen,
that's distributive justice.
yes, that's
Okay.
an example of distributive justice. In other words, if you own 10% of the shares of a company, you should get 10% of the profits. Of course, on the downside, you also suffer 10% of the losses if it comes to that. The problem is, of course, is that people think that companies have to retain earnings instead of paying them out in order to finance new capital. That's not the way finance really works. Commercial banks and central banks were invented to create money backed by the present value of capital. Somebody says, I have this great idea to build a factory and I need $1 million to build it. And judging from all the experts tell me, we expect it to have, income capacity that in present terms is $2 million. I should be able to take this, they call it a bill of exchange to be technical, and take that to a banker and say, I have this project that has a present value of $2 million, but I need financing for it. I need $1 million. Can I have it? And the banker, if it's a commercial bank, see, commercial banks can create money, but only if there's something of value to back the money with. And I won't get into the intricacies of money creation. We'll just say that a commercial bank can create money backed by the value of the assets that are put together to form capital. Now, they create the money, which expands the money supply. It's put into the capital. It's called forming capital. The capital becomes profitable. The loan is repaid and the money's canceled. So the money supply expands and contracts along with the needs of the economy, and you avoid both deflation and inflation. It's a completely different way of looking at money. The Keynesians, the monetarists, and the Austrians don't look at money that way. Only what they call the banking principle economists like Kelso. And I think of all the schools of economics today, Kelso's binary economics is the only one that is called banking principle, because it's the only one, in my opinion, that looks at money correctly. Now, having gone through all that, that was Kelso's vision. It was combined with Catholic social teaching through Father William Ferry, who was an expert in the social doctrine of Pope Pius XI. And Father Ferry's doctoral thesis was the act of social justice. Now, the act of social justice consists of people getting organized and, as members of groups, acting directly on social institutions to open up participation and remove barriers so that everyone who is qualified can participate in these institutions as full members of society. The one that Norman Kurland and Mac McGrath and the others were interested in was, how do we reform the money system to make it possible to make every person an owner, just as Kelso and Leo XIII and later Pius XI and the other popes wanted. So what I'll say we, because I'm now with CESJ, so include me among the we of the people who did work that I had no hand in, which was putting together Catholic social thought with regards to social justice. And Kelso and Mortimer Adler, he co-authored 2 books. Louis Kelso co-authored 2 books with the Aristotelian philosopher Mortimer Adler with terrible titles: The Capitalist Manifesto and The New Capitalists. What he meant was a capital-intensive economy in which everyone owns, not what the communists who invented the term meant by capitalism, which was concentrated private ownership. So combining the act of social justice with Kelso's economic, 3 principles of economic justice and the financing technique, we come up with what we call the just third way of economic personalism. We've changed names quite a few times over the years, but we think that that's the fine name we're going to stick with. And Kelso's 3 principles of economic justice are participation. Everyone should have the access to the opportunity and means to participate in all social institutions. A distribution, in other words, what you put into something should be commensurate with what you get out of it, or the results of it. And Kelso called it the principle of limitation. We call it social justice. See, we think of social justice as the corrective principle, so that if participative justice, the principle of participation, or distributive justice, the principle of distribution, are out of whack. In other words, what you're getting out doesn't match what you're putting in. Then social justice gets to work, reforms the institutions, and gets them so that they function once again properly, so that participative and distributive justice function the way they should. Now, in Father Ferry's terms, or in those of Pius XI, what social justice does is, if there is a flawed institution, you work on the institution so that it once again functions to do the job it was designed to do. And so that social justice does not replace individual virtues like justice or charity. It makes the individual virtues possible once again. See, a lot of people think that social justice means, oh, well, if people don't have enough to eat, you feed them. Or if they're naked, you clothe them. No, those are individual. Those are corporal acts of mercy.
Right. So if I go by someone in the street who's begging for money, and if I do give to them, and I do it in such a way that, I'm not blowing a trumpet before myself to show off, and I'm not letting my left hand know what my right hand is doing like that, and I do it out of genuine, charity without expecting anything back, as though the person were perhaps Christ in a distressing disguise, as Mother Teresa would have said, then I cannot say that I have done an act of social justice.
No, you have carried out an act of individual charity.
Individual charity, and it's an individually virtuous act. So virtue belongs. So would you say that virtue belongs to the individual as a person, to the person, right? But not to the institution.
Yeah.
What we look for in an institution is what would you call, like a just ordering, right?
Or as John Paul II said, a structure of virtue.
A structure, a structure of virtue.
People can be virtuous. The word virtue comes from Latin meaning manness, but the connotation, but the construction is humanness.
Right. Well, I'm fine with manliness, because Christ is a man and he is the model for all of us, whether male or female. So that's good. Yeah.
The way you want to do it, but humanness works better because the Greek word that Aristotle used, which I can't even pronounce, I don't even know what it is, meant the capacity to become virtuous, as well as the capacity to become vicious. The common good, strictly speaking, is this, the way Aquinas called it, the analogously complete capacity to acquire and develop virtue, or to become virtuous. And this is analogously complete in every single human being of any stage of development of any kind or anything else. What we do with that is up to us, with our free will and our what they call accidentals. Are, suppose you're missing an arm or a leg or something, and that prevents you from doing something. Well, that doesn't change your substance. You still have this analogously complete. I say analogously complete because it's not the same, although that's an easy way of putting it.
Right.
So the same, but that's the wrong word. It's like when Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you a king?" And Jesus says, "Well, that's your word for it."
Yeah.
It's not. It's a very difficult concept, but basically what it means is that the good common to every single human being is to be infinitely perfectible by becoming virtuous. Of course, at the same time, we are also infinitely imperfectible, meaning we can become vicious as well. Now, God, however, is infinitely perfect. And to be infinitely perfectible is not the same as being infinitely perfect. So don't go around thinking you're God just because you share an incomplete analogy with God.
Right.
In his
Well, here's an illustration I would use. I've used with my, like when I was homeschooling my kids, and I would talk about, that people have different capacities, but it's like you may have different size glasses, glasses in like the things you pour water in. I say you may have different size, but everyone can decide to fill theirs with skills and with knowledge and with trying, or you can decide just to fill it up, part way. But they're analogous because everyone has been given a certain amount of capacity. And so they have the responsibility to develop that virtuously.
Yeah, let me correct that.
Okay.
Because what you stated was the way Aristotle had it.
Okay.
And what Aquinas did was correct Aristotle. In other words,
I'm willing to be corrected by Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah, if you're going to be corrected, you might as well be corrected by the best.
That's right.
You see, Aristotle's mistake was to assume that people had different capacities for virtue. And some people who appeared to be human had no capacity at all. These were natural slaves. See, slaves can't be virtuous because they're not human. So they can't have humanness. They can't acquire it. And of course, some people have different capacities and types for different kinds of humanists. One person will do this well, another person will do that well. Some people will do nothing well. Women, of course, have a capacity, but they can't use it. This is Aristotle. Children can grow into their capacity. And Aquinas said, no, that can't be right, because going by Aristotle's own first principle of reason, that which is true is as true and is true in the same way as everything else that is true. That's the first principle of reason, stated as the principle of identity. There's also the negative way of saying it, called the principle of contradiction, or the law of contradiction, which is nothing can both be and not be at the same time under the same conditions. Which, if you think about it, the principle of identity and the principle of contradiction say the same thing in different ways.
Right.
So what Aquinas said was, you can't have different capacities for every single human being, or that could not be the thing that is common to every human being and that defines us as human.
Ah, okay.
So it must be not identical, unless, of course, you're just speaking colloquially, in which case every human being has the same identical capacity to acquire and develop virtue. But in philosophy, to be strictly accurate, you can't say identical. You have to say analogously complete. In other words, we are all analogs of each other, which you remember, analog TV. Well, that looks like the film, that plays like the film, it talks like the film, but it's not the film, it's an analog of the film.
Okay.
In other words, you're seeing the film. When I'm watching The Quiet Man with John Wayne and Marina Hara, I'm watching the movie as far as I'm concerned. But a television technician would have said, under the old system, oh, no, no, you're watching an analog of the film, not the film.
Ah, okay.
So it's like, who cares? I'm just watching the film. And so for most people, who cares whether I say the same capacity for virtue or the analogously complete capacity for virtue? I don't care. Well, only a philosopher cares. And then you can get
Okay.
into some real neat arguments. But and I hope a friend of mine who's a philosophy professor doesn't see this.
Okay, so I didn't say it quite right to the children. That I shouldn't have used the word capacity is probably not the word
Yeah, you have
that would have been
different,
correct.
everyone has different accidentals.
Okay,
So in other words, your substance is your capacity to acquire and develop virtue. Now, your accidentals enable you to act on that.
okay.
In other words,
Okay, so back to the question of action, and when I said, you know, the man that was on the side of the street, you know, giving him the money as an act of personal virtue of charity. Okay,
right.
but what then would be an act of social justice that would be addressing that same situation, but would be social justice?
Okay. Acts of social justice are almost always preceded by acts of social charity. Social charity doesn't mean widespread charity. What it means is you love your institution as you love yourself. And what that means is that you have to learn about your institutions and figure out what is wrong with this institution that is preventing this person from having an income. Okay, suppose he's a bricklayer. I can't find work. Well, they're building buildings down the street and they're laying bricks. Why can't you? Are you an incompetent bricklayer? Says, oh no, I'm a professional. Well, then why can't you work? Well, because I'm black and they're only hiring whites. Okay, what you do is you get organized with other people and you go to the union or whoever is governing who can get hired for that job. And you say, you can't distinguish between, you know, anybody who wants to be a bricklayer except whether they're a good bricklayer or a bad bricklayer. Anybody who is a good bricklayer should be able to work for you as long as you need workers. Okay. And at the same rate of pay and everything else. Now, you haven't directly helped that guy who wants to be a bricklayer, but what you've done is work on the institution that says, okay, now you go up and apply for a job because they are hiring bricklayers. And if they don't hire you, you now can say, oh, you're being unjust because I have every qualification to fill this job. Now that's a very crude act of social justice because it doesn't really address the real underlying problem is how do people get income? The assumption I built into that illustration was, oh, you get an income by getting a job. The situation that Kelso addressed, and which Faree's analysis of Pius XI's social doctrine enabled, was how do we solve this income problem in a way that we don't have to worry whether there's enough jobs? Because there's this thing called Say's law of markets, which Karl Marx and John Maynard Keynes rejected because they assumed the only way to get income was to work at a job. But Say's law of markets, which is very simply put, and most people will take it very incorrectly, production equals income. Therefore, supply generates its own demand and demand its own supply. Well, a more extended explanation of that is that production, there's only one way to consume, and that's to produce. You must either produce for yourself, for your own consumption, or you must produce enough to trade to someone else for what that someone else has produced that you want to consume. So that if everything worked exactly the right way, which of course it never does, but in an ideal world, that everything that was produced would be consumed either by yourself or to the person you traded what you produced to, that for something that you wanted to produce.
Well, isn't capital that which is produced but is not consumed but used to produce more capital?
No, you're thinking in past savings terms.
Okay.
See, there are two ways to produce, either with your labor or with your capital. And almost all production somehow involves capital at some point, because capital is just a tool. It's the non-human factor of production. Now, some people think that within the past savings paradigm, they think, oh, consumption is only direct consumption by people, not consumption as a whole, meaning things are being used up. So that when you make a tool, you're not consuming it directly, but you're using up the tool when you do it. So what you're doing is you're producing a good. The only reason a capital good and a consumer good are differentiated is because one is consumed directly and the other is used to produce other goods, which, as you pointed out. Now, throughout history, a lot of people have assumed as a matter of course, the only way to make a tool is to save up and then create the tool. But what if somebody is a tool maker and you say, I need a spear? Well, I want to trade the meat that I kill for the spear, but I won't have any meat to trade for the spear until I get the spear to kill the meat.
Right.
So you catch 22. So what you do is, if you're smart and if you're trustworthy, you go to the spear maker and say, if you give me that spear, I will give you so much meat until I give you this quantity out of my future kills. Do you agree? And what you've done is you just invented credit. So you get the spear on credit, you go out and kill a bunch of animals and then give the guy, the spear maker, the meat that you promised him. See, that's all that money is. Money is just a promise. It's not itself a commodity. If you're stuck in what they call the past savings assumption, which is, oh, first I have to accumulate something before I can finance new capital. No, you don't. What you need to do is the ability to make a promise, to say, I will pay you for this new capital out of the future profits of the capital itself. Capital should be self-liquidating. Otherwise, why do it?
So how would that approach be more just institutionally than the approach we're currently using? And one thing I'm particularly interested in is, how would that approach keep from concentrating economic power, which then concentrates political power?
Very easily. Because if what you say is anyone who is creditworthy can borrow to finance new capital formation, so that every person now has the potential to own capital. See, if you assume that first you have to have the cash accumulated before you can buy capital, you just restricted it to the rich. Because who can afford to save except the rich? Because
Right.
They're producing far more than they can consume. Whereas the other people, they can't even get enough to consume to begin with. So that if you shift from past savings, which are perfectly legitimate, because past savings are what you purchase goods to consume directly with. But future savings is what you can purchase new capital with to pay for itself, and then use the income from the new capital to consume with.
So what are the financial instruments that make this possible? You mentioned the ESOPs earlier.
Okay, that's
What
a
other
vehicle,
financial-
not an instrument.
Pardon?
That's a vehicle, not an instrument.
Oh, it's a vehicle. Okay.
The first principle of finance. This is according to Benjamin Anderson, the financial historian. The first principle of finance is to know the difference between a mortgage and a bill of exchange. Now, you're already sorry you asked, aren't you? A
I'm
mortgage,
interested.
a mortgage is a past savings instrument. And most people are familiar with home mortgages, but a mortgage is any financial instrument that is drawn on an existing asset. It's like, technically, if you have a warehouse full of goods that you want to sell, you drop a mortgage on them, take it to a factor or something, and they buy the mortgage from you so that they own it. But you got the cash. You sold the inventory by drawing up a mortgage on it, on your existing wealth.
Right.
A bill of exchange is a future saving instrument. In other words, you say, I have this project that I want to finance. It doesn't exist yet, but if I can get $100,000, I will have it and I will pay you back. Or 90. The example used in all the finance textbooks is 98,000, 2% discount rate. See, a mortgage bears interest. A bill of exchange has a discount.
Why?
Because a mortgage is for things that exist, whereas a bill of exchange is for stuff that does not yet exist, but is reasonably expected to. But there's the time value of money, there's opportunity cost, there's present value. So that something that you get in a year or 90 days that's worth $100,000 in 90 days may only be worth 98,000 today. So what you do,
the depreciation is
not
of the
depreciation.
stuff. It's so, okay, so the stuff
It's not
itself.
depreciation, it's a discount. Depreciation is something else. You made the mistake of talking to a CPA here.
Okay, so the discount is based on, okay, let me just see if I can understand this. So the discount is based on the fact that the stuff itself is decreasing in value over time.
No, it's that $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow, simply because
Oh, so it's
it
based,
today.
okay, so it's being based on the inflation of the money.
Not necessarily inflation, but risk.
Oh, okay.
Other things. In other words, I have $1 I have today, I have it in my hand. But what if something happens before tomorrow occurs that I don't get the $1 that I'm promised tomorrow? I figure there's a 2% chance that something's going to happen. So I will sell you my $1 tomorrow for 98 cents today. And then you will assume the risk by taking the claim that I have for $1 tomorrow and give me 98 cents for it. And tomorrow you will claim the $1, making 2 cents on the deal. A lot.
Okay, so it's the money. It's not the money that's paid back that's less. It's the money that's loaned.
Yeah, or the money that's created there,
The
because
money that's created. Okay, gotcha.
And
Okay,
then when it's paid, it's canceled. See,
okay.
and you say that mortgages and bills of exchange are different because mortgages result from past decreases in consumption, whereas bills of exchange result from future increases in production. Do you see the difference?
Okay. Well, so where is this actually being used? Where are
It's
these
used every
things?
day in the financial markets. They just don't know that they're doing it because they're all stuck in Keynesian economics and they're calling them different things.
Okay.
What you have today, strangely enough, is bills of exchange bearing interest. I thought, bills of exchange can't bear interest. That's not what they do. But see, they're thinking in Keynesian or monetarist. It's called the currency principle, which, if you really wanted to get complicated, we could get into that. But we should probably get back to the whole union of social justice and Kelso's principles of economic justice.
Okay, so let me
You can
ask the
really get into
question.
the weeds
Let me
on
ask the question in that way. Let me ask the question according to this. So, so right now what we have is a situation where like just take for homes or for business property, people get mortgages. And over the life of that mortgage, they end up paying way more than what it's actually worth because they pay all the interest. One of the things that I think about sometimes is land. It's like people get mortgages for land. And then when the land is sold, there's another mortgage. And it's as though the fruit of that land, instead of being the actual productive capacity of that land in, say, in the grazing of animals or the raising of crops or something like that, is actually, it's money. They say money doesn't grow on trees, but for banks it does.
Well,
Because they can keep loaning money on that same
well,
piece of property over and over.
No, you're mixing apples and oranges here.
All right, okay, I might be, but let me just ask, what I'm trying to get at is we have a system that concentrates wealth where a lot of what we pay for everything, if you go through the whole process of production, a lot of what we pay for everything ends up actually being interest. The interest on all the loans that are made for all the people that are producing everything down the line is like a burden that's added to the cost for all of us, right?
Yeah. And this is getting into another whole area. And I have a whole series of lectures on what's wrong with the consumption money system and the productive money system. And what is occurring is that the commercial banking system is being used to finance exactly the opposite of what it should be being used to be financed. See, anything dealing with a mortgage, existing assets, should be financed not out of newly created money, but out of existing money. Because it is withheld consumption, and basically production is money, one way or another. It gets very complicated.
Well, what I'm trying to get at is, in what way would revising that, because I guess what I want to get at is this difference between social justice and individual virtue and how they're connected, is how making these kinds of revisions that the Center for Economic and Social Justice advocates for, right?
Okay.
Making these structural changes, how that is going to help us to have more personal virtue, make more personal virtue possible.
Okay, I'll try to summarize it as quickly as I can,
Okay.
and without getting into the technicalities.
Right.
What Leo XIII advocated in Rerum Novarum was that as many as possible of the people become owners. What Kelso advocated was a way that they could, which is buy self-liquidating capital and pay it off with the future profits of the capital itself. Now, how an individual person becomes creditworthy is another whole long lecture. But basically what Kelso did was make it possible for ordinary people like us, without vast accumulations, to create and acquire wealth on the same basis that the rich have always done it. It is a myth that the rich first accumulated money and then bought their capital. No, what they did was figure out a way that they could get banks or other financial institutions to create money. They then buy the capital pays for itself, and they repay the lending institution so that the money is first created, then canceled, avoiding inflation and deflation. The rich have always been able to do this. During the Middle Ages, the Jews were the bankers, and people thought they were magicians because they seemed to be able to create money out of nothing. Well, they weren't creating money out of nothing. What they were doing was creating money backed by future savings, which is perfectly legitimate, except when you're trying to tell people who only are in the past savings paradigm that, and they figure, oh, first you have to accumulate money before you can spend it.
So
well,
how would that aid in individual virtue? Is it because it opens up the market to more people?
Well, what it does is, remember, power follows property.
Right.
Now, if you have more people who can purchase capital, they acquire power. They are no longer totally under the control of a wage payer, their employer, or the state giving them welfare. They are now independent, at least with respect to their income. Of course, as a member of society, you still have to work and produce and market your goods and services and everything else. But the fact is, you are no longer what Aristotle called a masterless slave. See, to Aristotle, a nominally free person who didn't own any capital was worse off than an actual slave, because a slave participated in his master's virtue or something, his master's life, and he was an extension of his master. Whereas the poor worker who owned nothing but his labor, he was dirt, nothing. One of the remarkable things about Jesus's ministry on earth was that he treated propertyless workers the same as everybody else. This was astonishing. I mean, who treats these people? I mean, they're not slaves, so we don't have to treat them well because the owner's going to come after us. They're nobody, they're nothing. And Jesus treated them as if they're real people. Amazing. But that still doesn't release us from the obligation that if you've got a lot of people who don't own anything, to restructure our institutions, financial ones, our insurance companies. See, one of the reasons the rich can borrow or create money is because they have wealth already to secure the loan that they're making, that they're getting.
Right.
Well, what Kelso said was, why can't ordinary people, in a sense, rent collateral by taking out an insurance policy that will pay off if they don't repay the loan? It was a brilliant breakthrough. So what Kelso did was make it possible for anybody to become a capital owner. Thus, anybody can acquire power. Power is legally defined as the ability for doing. Well, how do you become virtuous or vicious without doing something? Because virtue is the habit of doing good.
Right.
So you have to be able to do something, which requires power, and power follows property. So making as many as possible of the people into capital owners means you're making as many as possible of the people with power so that they can become virtuous. Now, where Pius XI comes in with this is, but what if our institutions are so poorly structured that they encourage vice rather than virtue? Well, an institution is a social habit, just like a virtue is an individual habit.
Say that again.
An institution is a social habit. Think about it. What is an institution but a specific way of doing something in society?
Okay, so let me see if I can name an institution, and we can, like I would say, here's an institution, the Kiwanis Club.
Okay, they have a constitution, they have rules of order, they have all kinds of things that says this is this organization and no other. How do you know you're a member of Kiwanis?
I guess you pay dues and you participate in their activities.
And you follow their rules and obey their bylaws and everything else.
Right.
You are following their social habits.
Ah, okay.
So this is why, for instance, John Paul II called institutions not virtuous in and of themselves, but structures of virtue or structures of vice, because they are not virtuous or vicious in and of themselves, but they can encourage people to go one way or another. Now,
so I think what we want is a society the structures of which encourage individual virtue as much as possible.
right.
In other words, maybe we could say that what we want out of our government is government to make it easy for people to be good and difficult for people to be bad, or something like that.
Yeah. In crude terms, yes, because the government is concerned, or the state, with the common good. The manifestation of the common good for us as political animals, as Aristotle called us, is that vast network of institutions within which we carry out our business of living, becoming virtuous.
Okay.
So that the government is charged with the primary responsibility of looking after that network. Now, we also have an individual responsibility to look after that network. Our institutions are our responsibility. The act of social justice is that if our institutions are flawed, however you do that grammatically. You're a homeschooling mom, you should know these things. It's our responsibility to organize with others to correct the institution so that it again encourages us or makes it possible for us to be virtuous.
So, social justice is that organizing that we do with others to change or to correct,
the common,
or even sometimes to establish institutions.
Yeah, that's part of it.
Yeah. So, so that's why social justice actually can never actually be practiced as an individual alone, regardless of what good thing you're doing.
Yeah, Father Ferry made this abundantly clear in his doctoral thesis. He said, the efficient cause, meaning the actor, the one who carries out the act of a virtue, can only be a member of a group. That's it. You, as an individual acting on your own initiative, cannot carry out an act of social justice. You can only do it as a member of a group. And that means acting in accordance with the rules of your group and with the consent and persuasion of all the other members of the group.
And that's why Catholic social teaching is so adamant about us having what I called in one of my lectures on distributism, a very thick social life, like a lot of layers in between us and the state, a lot of community groups and different things like that we can be part of, because the richer and thicker we make that social organization of our lives, then actually the less the state has to do.
Yes.
And the more protection there is for the individual and for the family vis-a-vis the power of the state.
Yeah, and believe it or not, a lot of this seems to have come out of Pius XI's familiarity with Alexis de Tocqueville. Did you ever read Democracy in America?
I've read parts of it. And
Well,
also there's Anthony Esselin's book on reclaiming Catholic social teaching.
Oh yeah, I've read it. I've got
where
it.
He talks about how social the Americans were, how they would go out into the frontier and without any direction from on high, they would, clear land, build a town, put a town square in, organize themselves, have a city council, build a school, build a church, have clubs, have benevolent associations and all of that done organically coming up from the people.
Yeah, this is what de Tocqueville was saying. It's in the section, I think it's in volume 1, and he says the role of association in American life. He says Americans seem by nature seem to form associations for everything. If there's a traffic jam, and you have never seen a traffic jam unless you've seen one with horse-drawn carriages, the citizens will get organized and straighten out the traffic jam. If they want to encourage temperance, they'll get organized with a temperance society. If they want a road paved, they'll get organized and get the road paved. Even children, when they're playing games, will get organized and set the rules for that game. And daily life in America is so organized that the central government at times seems hardly to function at all.
That'd be nice.
Well, it's the quintessence of subsidiarity. Subsidiarity does not mean that the state does whatever an individual cannot do for himself. I've seen that definition actually used by very sincere Catholic intellectuals. No, subsidiarity means the most appropriate level of whatever level of the common good you're talking about carries out the function. If it's national defense, well, clearly the individual or the small town militia is not the group to carry out national defense. That's the national government's responsibility. But suppose you have banditry in the area. Well, that's when the marshal or the town sheriff organizes the posse and goes after them. Why bring in the national government if you can handle it yourself? Assuming, of course, you're not violating anyone's rights by doing so.
Right.
Because
and why would a local school be regulated from Washington, D.C.?
yeah, there's no reason to do it. Now, it would be in the national interest for the national government to say, we don't care what kind of school you have as long as you don't break any laws and meet these minimal educational requirements. But that's all we're going to say.
Right, right. Okay, well, this was a great conversation. I really appreciate it. And I want to just summarize something that I think is important, which was like the key point that I wanted to get to was to define social justice. So I'm going to say it back to you. You tell me if I'm saying it correctly. So social justice, those involves the institutions and our participation in institutions that indirectly affect individual virtue. Whereas our individual virtue, when we do acts of individual virtue, they indirectly affect the social justice.
Yes.
They have an indirect effect
on the social order.
On the social order. So I cannot, as an individual, do an act of social justice, which I think puts the lie to some of the things that we're hearing constantly bombarding us today, which is this idea that somehow or another, by my doing something, whether it's, protesting, throwing a brick through a window, or running a soup kitchen or whatever, that somehow I'm doing social justice.
Yes, as Father Ferry pointed out in an unpublished manuscript, which we've never gotten around to revising and completing, he died in 1986. So it, or was it 85? Anyway, it doesn't matter. Is that some of these things can be very valuable. I mean, if you need a soup kitchen to get people fed, you need a soup kitchen.
Right.
But it's not social justice. But so many people get caught up in doing these things. He says, a lot of what people mistake for social justice is demands that somebody else do something.
Right, right.
Social justice involves you doing something, getting organized with others and acting directly on the common good, the institutions, in order to make it possible to get things straightened out again.
Good. Well, that was very helpful. I really appreciate it. And it's just delightful to get to talk to you. And it's sometimes when you're talking, it's like I'm drinking from a fire hose because it's so much, and you have such a good technical grasp of all of these things. And I hope that we'll get to talk again. And thank you so much for being on my channel. So would you like to say anything about where people should go to get in touch with your work? And I will put links to that, of course, in the show notes.
Yeah. Well, I think, given the topic that we covered today, the best thing to do is to go to the CESJ website, and there's a free ebook section. And you can download a number of the things in PDF, but the one you really want to look at, and this is the one I had open, which I never got to the full discussion. Can you see that there? Let's see.
Introduction to Social Justice.
Yeah. Father Ferry wrote this in 1948 for high school students. So it's probably about super graduate level right now. And it's at www.cesj.org. You go to the menu bar under resources, and there you pull down and it'll say free ebooks or something like that. And you go and there's a whole bunch of them, all of which of course are worth reading, but this is a pamphlet that you may want to start with. You can read Father Ferry's doctoral thesis, The Act of Social Justice, too, but I don't recommend that the first thing you read.
Okay.
Introduction to Social Justice with our foreword and Father Ferry's text And there's even study questions at the back, so you can test yourself to see how well you got it in. I mean, I've been reading that pamphlet for more than 30 years. And I keep finding new things in it every time I read it.
Yeah.
That's how profound it is.
Yes, Catholic social teaching is very profound, and you can read things over and over again and keep mining it. And that's one of the things that I love about it, and that I love about the Catholic faith. I'm a convert, and it's like, it's such an intellectual and spiritual smorgasbord to be Catholic.
And you can also get free copies of Kelso and Adler's books, The Capitalist Manifesto and The New Capitalist. As I said, lousy titles, but great books.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And I hope that we will get to talk again. So I'm going to stop the recording now.
Okay.
All right. All right. Thank you, everyone.